welcome to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas, a podcast on the lesser-known aspects of religion and belief.
Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of Religion Off the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Robin Douglas, and today we have with us Dr. Francis Young. Francis is the author of 18 books on a range of subjects relating to religion, history, and politics. Francis, welcome and thanks for being with us today.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Now, today we're going to be talking about the subject of political magic in England, Wales, and Scotland. And you have a new book about this out at the moment, don't you, called Magic in Merlin's Realm?
Yes, that's right. The books are called Magic in Merlin's Realm, a history of occult politics in Britain.
And you've written on this subject before, haven't you, in a book I think called Magic as a Political Crime?
Yes, that's right. I brought out a book in 2017, which is called Magic as a Political Crime in Medieval and Early Modern England with Bloomsbury. And that book really looks at just one aspect of the relationship between magic and politics in British history, which is sort of the darker side of the ways in which magic was used as a form of sedition or treason. Whereas the new book really looks at the whole picture of the relationship between magic and politics in Britain.
Okay. And just by way of background, could you briefly sum up what your argument was in your earlier book?
So in Magic as a Political Crime, I argued that magic was a very versatile accusation that could be used to smear people that the state, the regime, wanted to silence or get rid of, in the sense that magic is a slur that really sticks. It's one of those crimes, certainly in the medieval and the early modern period, if you even hinted at the possibility that somebody might be guilty of dabbling in the dark arts, then it was a good way to trash their reputation. And it was also a good way of accusing people of treason without necessarily proving that they'd done anything active towards raising an army or really planning in a realistic way to kill the king. Because the crime of treason, as it was defined in the 14th century, merely involved compassing and imagining the death of the king. And clearly, if you've performed some kind of magical act or cast a king's horoscope or something like that, then you have imagined the possibility that the king might die and tried to bring it about by some kind of occult means. So my argument really is that whether or not these events really happened doesn't matter so much. What really matters is that this was a really useful way of discrediting people that you wanted out of the way who were inconvenient to a regime.
So even casting the king's horoscope could land you in trouble for treason? Absolutely,
and there were specific laws eventually in the 1580s against casting the monarch's horoscope. And it was something which, on the one hand, it was something that monarchs might themselves request. They wanted to know what was in their horoscopes, not least because if they were interested in astrological medicine, for example, Henry VI was repeatedly treated by astrologers. So it might be something that comes from the crown, but also if it's done in an unauthorized way by someone who has not been instructed by the crown to cast that horoscope, then the casting of a horoscope can easily be conflated with necromancy, with the raising of demons. And it's something which certainly to the ignorant or to those who weren't versed in astrology might appear to be much more sinister than it really was. And so we have numerous cases where something that was probably really just little more than a bit of dabbling in astrology becomes inflated into much more serious crimes of demon conjuring.
Okay. So that's the subject of magic as treason or crime. But in this new book, you broaden out the theme to include other forms of magic.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, it goes beyond what we might necessarily consider to be magic at all into the broader field of occult disciplines. So I look at the role played by alchemy, the role played by astrology related to astral magic. I look at Renaissance magic, natural magic, and its interaction with politics. I look at prophecy as well, and the ways in which that might have been significant, as well as what we might think of when we are asked to imagine medieval magic, which is somebody trying to conjure up a demon in order to perform wondrous feats. So yes, it's the whole gamut really of occult traditions. And one of the things that I focus on is the positive evaluations that were made of many of these occult traditions in relation to monarchy. And really key to that is the figure of Merlin, and that's really why his name is in the title. Now, Merlin didn't exist. He's purely a literary confabulation of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century. But crucially, he is this figure who lends a degree of legitimacy to the idea of magic being involved in politics, because, of course, Merlin is portrayed in medieval literature as the royal advisor to King Arthur. And not only does it lend a certain degree of legitimacy to the idea that magic might be involved in politics, but it's also within this legendary British context. So it's appropriate for a king of England or a king of Scots to invoke magic, because he can always say, well, I'm like King Arthur. I'm King Arthur's successor. So, these people that I'm employing to be my magical advisor, they are essentially Merlins. They are fitting into that role. And there are a number of people throughout history who do attempt to take on that mantle of Merlin.
I think that some of our listeners will probably have heard of one of those, namely John Dee, who of course worked for Elizabeth I. But generally speaking, these people would be fairly obscure, wouldn't they?
Yeah, some of them are obscure. Some of them are quite well known. Many of the listeners may have heard of Michael Scott, who was a 12th century and 13th century Scottish writer on magic, who after his death gains this reputation as a great wizard. You've also got Roger Bacon, a fairly well-known figure who seems to have given some sort of occult advice to Henry III. But others probably are a bit more obscure, like George Ripley, for example, in the 15th century gives occult medical advice to Edward IV. And yeah, you've got various astrological physicians who are employed by successive monarchs. And really the last person who attempted to take on this mantle was a chap called Goodwin Wharton, who attempted to give magical advice to William and Mary. So right at the end of the 17th century. That is, if we don't count Aleister Crowley, who attempted to become Churchill's magical advisor during the Second World War, but was not successful in gaining an audience with Winston Churchill. But yes, certainly the best known figure who I think fits this mold of an attempted Merlin is John Dee. And in a way, he's the only one who truly succeeds, in that he does manage, at least for a time, to gain Elizabeth's ear and actually has a significant effect on the formulation of policy.
And he was the person who invented certainly the phrase, if not the concept, of the British Empire, isn't he?
Absolutely. Certainly the idea of the British Empire, and that phrase is John Dee's. It goes back to a bit earlier in the sense of the idea of England being an empire. So we find in the Statute in Restraint of Appeals in 1534, which is preventing people from making any kind of appeal to Rome because Henry VIII is the supreme head of the Church of England. It has this preamble which contains the phrase, "This realm of England is an empire." And what that means in that context is not to do with having colonies, what we might think of an empire being, but total independence from the papacy. So the same kind of claims that were made by the Holy Roman Emperor. But then Dee takes that idea and relates it to these Arthurian myths about Arthur and various other figures of Welsh mythology crossing the ocean, a bit like Brendan the Navigator, and finding these strange new lands. And he says, well, clearly this new world that's been discovered on the other side of the Atlantic is the land that was spoken of in these myths and was discovered by Arthur. And therefore, Elizabeth and the House of Tudor, as the Welsh descendants of King Arthur, have a hereditary right to the entire new world. And this is something which certainly has an effect on Elizabeth's thinking with regard to the New World. And you've got events, of course, like the foundation of the original Virginia colony at Roanoke by Sir Walter Raleigh. These are early attempts at English colonization, which are certainly related to the kind of stuff that Dee was saying.
Good heavens. So Dee genuinely changed the course of history.
I think he did, yes. And he certainly, even though a lot of these things that he said were disputed, or there were other courtiers who were peddling a different narrative, I think the idea of a British Empire does have a lasting effect, especially because James VI of Scotland comes to the throne as James I of England, and so suddenly this idea of Great Britain is thrown into the spotlight. And so while that idea might well have died with Dee, in fact it carries on because of that accident of dynastic succession. And yeah, certainly the idea of the British Empire because of that, becomes much more significant later.
Okay. And Dee's known for other esoteric activities, isn't he? He famously believed that he could talk to angels.
Yes, absolutely. And it's interesting that during his own lifetime, very few people knew that Dee was involved in this angel conjuring, even though there were various accusations against him of being a conjurer, because his diaries were private, they were secret, they weren't discovered until the 17th century. And then they were published in 1652 by Merrick Casaubon, or part of them were. And it's interesting that those diaries then, in their print form, go on to have immense influence in the 19th century, because they're rediscovered by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, and they become the basis for the idea of Enochian magic in the work of Aleister Crowley. So they go on to have this kind of afterlife, but it's an afterlife which takes a number of centuries for it to actually come to fruition. But yes, the rest of his diaries were lost for even longer, but were preserved by Elias Ashmole, who himself was a magician, as well as a great collector of manuscripts and the founder of the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. But yes, now they're all there in the British Library. So we have a full picture of Dee's magical practice, which is rare. We don't normally have, a complete insight into exactly what was going on in somebody's personal magical practice.
Okay. You mentioned James VI and First. He's an interesting character, isn't he? Because he considered himself to be something of an expert on the occult and the dark arts. And Shakespeare, I believe, wrote the Scottish play as an entertainment to be put on for him.
Yes, James I is a very interesting figure in that he is not only very interested in witchcraft, but he also believes that he himself is immune from it. So when he was King of Scots before his accession to the throne of England in 1589, he believes that witches have attempted to sink the ship in which he's returning from Denmark with his bride, Anne of Denmark. And he believes that the witches need to be brought to justice, and puts them on trial personally himself. This is a bit of a penchant he had for kind of taking over judicial proceedings. And he believes that he's completely immune from the power of witches because he is an anointed king. So you've got this strange irony with James I that, while he's obsessed with witchcraft, he's also obsessed with the divine right of kings, and the two kind of cancel each other out, because he believes that, an anointed king can't possibly be harmed by witches. But at the same time, he advises his son, when he's giving advice on ruling, to be very strict with witches. And, the two kinds of people that you must never forgive is traitors and witches. But he also fancies himself as an expert. He writes this book called The Demonology in 1597. And because he fancies himself as an expert, he's actually one of the less credulous people about witchcraft. And it's a bit of a misconception about James I that he was, very credulous, because he was actually quite keen to show that he knew the difference between the real thing and a faker. And in order to do that, he had to let people off for witchcraft. And so what you find in James's reign is that there's actually something of a decline of prosecutions for witchcraft compared to the last years of Elizabeth I. But at the same time, there's this huge cultural resurgence of interest in witchcraft, because people know that James is interested in it. So when he becomes king in 1603 in England, you get lots and lots of plays and books and pamphlets about witchcraft. And eventually you get the Scottish play written by William Shakespeare, although that's more of an exaltation of James's supposed ancestors, the House of Banquo and so forth, rather than it is a play about, why you should be afraid of witches. Notably, of course, that the witches in Macbeth are never actually called witches. They're really fairies. They're not witches, which is something that we don't usually get conveyed in modern productions of the play.
Is that right? They're never actually referred to as witches in the text.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, they're never called witches. They're basically the Norns. The Norns are the three weird sisters of Norse belief who control the destinies of men. But they have a relationship with witchcraft. Certainly the wider public has a tendency to see the three weird sisters as these three human women who are witches, whereas actually they're non-human. They are, in terms of Scottish tradition, they would be the Norns. They'd be these supernatural beings. So yeah, they're more like fairies than they are witches.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't realize that. Looking more broadly at James I and his court and the other Stewart kings, what sort of occult activity do we get in that period?
The role that magic played in the Stewart court is critical, although largely of a negative character, because we have some very powerful individuals who are occult practitioners. For example, you've got Simon Foreman, who's a rather disreputable astrological physician who becomes very significant. Luckily, he's died before this can affect his reputation or destiny, but he's implicated in the Overbury plot, which is a notorious case of poisoning and betrayal in the Jacobean court, which creates this malaise, really, this impression that the Stewart court is a decadent place, alienating the population at large, who at that time are being drawn towards radical Protestant religious ideas, towards Puritanism. And the court seems to be going in the other direction, towards magical practices and necromancy and idolatry. And you see the same thing with the court masks that are being created by Inigo Jones, the architect, who creates these elaborate hermetic performances, which are essentially magical rituals. That's the way that they're portrayed, and appears to be the effect they're intended to have, where Charles I and Henrietta Maria will themselves take these roles as kind of magi in an attempt to bring order and stability to their unstable kingdoms. But of course, the reality was that they were living in a fantasy world, and without taking the practical action that was needed to reconcile their subjects to themselves, there was no hope, of magic bringing this about. And so there's a sense in which the Stewart court becomes ever more obsessed with the occult, but by doing so, it becomes tremendously out of touch. And one of the things that I write about in the book is the idea of magical quietism. So if you're a ruler who becomes excessively reliant on oracles, or excessively reliant on magic or astrology or occult forms of prediction, then that can actually paralyze your ability to act and do anything in the real world. And another good example of that is Richard II, who's somebody who seems to have become very attached to his soothsayers. And therefore, it's almost certain doom, really, for a monarch if they become addicted to the occult.
This is the kind of Rasputin dynamic, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I think, the Rasputin House of Romanov example is probably the best example in modern times that you can see of something like this. Although there are examples of heads of state who have also become quite reliant on occult practitioners. And Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti is another example of the dynamic there was more one of terrifying his own population with fear of his voodoo powers. But it's certainly something which hasn't gone away even today, the idea of rulers claiming to be in possession of occult powers, or rulers exploiting their population's belief in the occult in order to strengthen their rule.
The most powerful man in the world dabbled in the occult quite recently, if you believe the reports about Ronald Reagan and his predilection for astrology.
Well, yes. I mean, there is supposedly evidence that he was consulting astrologers, although I think that's something which Reagan probably wouldn't have wanted to make public. When you look in British history of more recent years, Diana, Princess of Wales, was heavily reliant on psychics and astrologers. And while that may not appear to be of any political significance, the reality was that she was somebody of soft political significance at the very least, insofar as she commanded such great affection from the British public. And it seems that in her particular case, it was a sort of chronic indecision within her personality, which meant that she found herself relying on anybody who could give her certainty. And that very much mirrors somebody like Richard II, who seems to have suffered from exactly the same thing, or indeed Henry VI, who seems to have been chronically indecisive and therefore incapable of ruling. So I think, even today, it can certainly be a concern if you've got a leader who's relying on oracles or astrologers.
It was said, wasn't it, in World War II, that either Hitler personally or at least the people around him came to believe that his rule had been spoken of by Nostradamus.
Yes, indeed. And, the Nazis, or certain Nazis, were obsessed with the occult. Heinrich Himmler is probably the most famous example, although Hitler himself seems to be rather equivocal about such things. But certainly we know that there was a chap in America called William Seabrook, who performed a ritual directed against Hitler, a kind of natural magic, effigy magic kind of ritual where a dummy was dressed as Hitler and the dummy eventually was set on fire. And that rite, which we know really did happen because we've got photographic and eyewitness evidence that it did, seems to have inspired people on the other side of the Atlantic to claim that they had performed similar rituals against Hitler, with the intention that rumors of those rituals would get back to senior Nazis and spook them. Now, we don't really know whether those rituals really happened. There are a number of claims about things that happened in the New Forest, things that Aleister Crowley claimed that he was involved in, and so forth. It remains, the jury's out really on how many of those things really happened. But you have to consider that, yes, if something like that had happened, perhaps it might have had an effect on spooking senior Nazis, especially somebody like Himmler, who did seem to believe in this kind of stuff. But all this remains very murky.
And that gets into the creation story of Wicca, doesn't it? Because one of the reports of a magical ceremony conducted against the Nazis was an alleged ceremony, as you mentioned, in the New Forest, which was said to have involved Gerald Gardner's friends who lay at the origins of the creation of Wicca.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Gardner claims that the New Forest Coven were involved in this, and he gives it really as a reason why some of the more elderly members of the New Forest Coven that he claimed passed on occult knowledge to him while they were no longer around, because they'd exhausted themselves in the rites that were used to create this psychic cone of power, which the New Forest Coven then supposedly directed against Nazi Germany. And whether this really happened is open to question. But there were people at the time, like for example, Diane Fortune, who was conducting various psychic operations, as she believed, against the Nazis. There were even people in MI6 who we know were MI6 officers who were involved in these kind of psychic astral plane activities, where they would sort of believe they'd send forth their spirit to do psychic battle with Nazi magicians on the astral plane. So yeah, it all very much ties in with the popularity of theosophy, the popularity of spiritualism on the outbreak of World War II. So I don't think we should be particularly surprised that we find these ideas surfacing in the context of conflict.
And I came across a reference to a ritual that was done during the Cuban Missile Crisis by British occultists to influence Nikita Khrushchev. Yes,
absolutely. There is some evidence of Cold War activity of this kind. There's interesting material from the State of Israel that there were various occasions, I think during the Six-Day War, when Kabbalists were supposedly mobilized in order to work various occult operations to ensure Israel's victory in the Six-Day War. And I mean, it's something that you'll find being deployed, witchcraft being deployed as a weapon of war within conflicts in parts of the developing world today. It's something which is not uncommon, really.
On the subject of the Cold War, you get rumors, don't you, of the CIA doing research into remote viewing and the like?
Yes, absolutely. I think that these things, certainly the closer you get to the present, the more likely these things are to be conflated with various kinds of pseudoscience or parapsychology and parapsychological investigations, where the language of magic is not really an acceptable language to use, even if what's going on is clearly pretty much the same as what's been practiced or believed in for centuries. And I think that, yes, when you look at things like the CIA remote viewing experiments, it springs from a fear that your opponents might have capabilities that you don't have. It doesn't necessarily mean that those who are planning such experiments genuinely believe that they would work, but there was always that possibility that the Soviets might have a capacity that you didn't. It's rather like the Helen Duncan case, the famous case of the medium Helen Duncan, who was put on trial during the Second World War because there was a fear, and there does seem evidence that this was really true from MI5, that she might have knowledge of the D-Day landings and would reveal them. And therefore, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in order to ensure that she received a custodial sentence over the period of the preparations for D-Day. And it's very telling, really, that these extraordinary measures were taken to ensure that she was in prison. Now, I don't think that MI5 were thereby endorsing the reality of spiritualism or saying that Helen Duncan genuinely was a spiritual medium. But in that kind of climate of fear and secrecy, you have to cover all your bases. And I think this is the context in which we should understand this kind of Cold War activity. It's not necessarily belief, but it is fear, and fear can make you do some of the strangest things.
Okay. And are there more recent examples of this kind of thing from the so-called War on Terror?
There's nothing that I'm aware of, but it would certainly be a fruitful line of inquiry to look into. I mean, something which did come up, which is a rather tragic example, is fake bomb detectors, which really is an example, I suppose, of the way in which pseudoscience can so easily creep in and receive, official sanction. There was a fraudster in the UK who was making fake bomb detectors, which were essentially just a piece of wire attached to nothing, saying that, these gave a 90%, probability of detecting bombs on people who were, going through checkpoints in Afghanistan and Iraq. And these were sold to the British Army. They were sold to Iraqi forces and Afghan forces. And people died as a result because, of course, they didn't work. They were completely useless. But the rationale that he was giving when people looked into them and opened them up and said, well, there appears to be no working parts in here, he was giving these pseudo-scientific and occult justifications of himself, which in many cases seem to have been accepted. And even the Department of Trade and Industry endorsed this product. So that's an example, I suppose, of how these ideas of pseudoscience, especially if you're talking about a situation of conflict and extreme stress, where people are maybe not making the best judgments, understandably, it is an opportunity for con men and fraudsters to come in with this kind of stuff and this kind of magical thinking. Magical thinking functions best where people's ability to think rationally is compromised, and clearly situations of crisis and stress are going to be those kind of situations.
Well, thank goodness we're not living through one of those now. If we turn now to number 10 Downing Street, is there any reason to believe that recent occupants there have dabbled in magical beliefs and practices? Because there were rumours about Cherie Blair, and in Andrew Gimson's biography, it said that Boris Johnson believes in supernatural omens.
I think it's almost inevitable that when somebody reaches a position of supreme power within the state, that they begin to think of themselves as in some way elevated beyond the normal concerns of human beings. And I think also there is a way in which, if you become elevated above everyone else in terms of your position of power, you are unwilling to accept all your advice from those who might be, beneath you or of a lower status. And therefore, there's always that temptation amongst the powerful that you seek, assistance from higher powers. Now, of course, that might take the traditional form of piety and religious practice, but it might also take the form of, receiving some kind of occult assistance, because you are almost, beyond the normal rules. And I think a lot of this stuff is rumor. It's unsubstantiated. We don't know whether it's really true. But I think something that we do see and can very clearly see is a kind of magical thinking within the circles of the most powerful, and a reliance on people who don't really have any real practical expertise, but do appear to have this hypnotic power and charisma. Certain recent advisors at Downing Street, might be considered to be in this category. Have been described as being like Svengali, with powers of apparent control over the Prime Minister. When you think of people like Peter Mandelson, who was always referred to as the Prince of Darkness. Clearly that was a joke, but at the same time there is a certain cutting edge to that, in that there's an implication that he is somehow involved in dealings, behind the scenes. There are various bits of political vocabulary that we still use today. So we talk about a cabal, as a close-knit group of politicians who are effectively working together to advance their agenda in a secret way. And that comes directly from the language of magic, from the Jewish Kabbalah and the idea of secrecy. And yeah, that sense that politics is a dark art is deeply, deeply rooted in Western culture. It goes right back to the ancient Greeks and the Romans. When you think of the language that the Romans used, the word conjuratio has the meaning of a conspiracy, a political conspiracy, but also has the meaning of conjuration, of the summoning of a spirit. So you've got there, the same language being used both for necromancy and also for politics. And I think there's that sense in which, we never fully understand, even after the event, even as historians, we never fully understand what was really going on in political intrigue. And so it does have this magical appearance. It does appear to be something which is entirely confected by the dark arts. So I think there is always going to be this strange, intimate relationship between politics and magic, even in the modern world.
I think this brings us on to something that we've already touched on, which is how magical beliefs are often nowadays translated into rationalistic language, but the underlying phenomena are the same. And I'm thinking in particular of Dominic Cummings, a man who has technical skills and knowledge, and he's clearly fascinated by tech. But if we went back to the Middle Ages, people would instantly recognize who he was, the court alchemist, or the strange advisor to the king's minister who has this warlock-like influence over his master, or at least he used to.
Oh, absolutely. And certainly, Dominic Cummings is somebody who relied on futurologists, people who claimed these, various abilities in being able to predict, through big data or whatever. But, the reality is that whatever data you've got, any attempt to predict the future is to a certain extent a matter of instinct and judgment, is liable to an interpretation, if not as occult, as a charismatic skill, as something which you don't necessarily qualify yourself to do it by the accuracy of your predictions, because they're too far ahead in the future to be verified, but you qualify yourself to do it by the extent to which you can convince the powerful that your interpretation is the right one.
Yeah, there's an ongoing component of the non-rational here, or the irrational, and in previous ages that would have been refracted through the language of magic and religion. But in the modern age, we translate that into the language of statistics, of science, of artificial intelligence, digital technology, etc.
Yes, indeed. And yet the reality is that we don't ultimately rely on, purely scientific methodologies. Certainly when it comes to politics, people seem to want confidence. They want, somebody in power who is able to project the idea that they know what's happening, or that they in some way can, purely by the power of their own personality and charisma, invoke the right outcomes. And it appears that in some cases, politicians themselves come to believe that if they say something forcefully enough or believe it forcefully enough, it will come to pass and be true. And we've certainly seen a great resurgence of that kind of magical thinking in the last few years in British politics. It's almost like a re-enchantment of British politics, that whereas go back to the 1990s, things were quite prosaic a lot of the time in terms of debates about monetary policy and so forth, whereas these sort of rather more colorful debates that we've seen enacted in the last few years about highly abstract concepts like sovereignty have almost approached the realms of the magical.
I think the high watermark of that I recall was when Boris Johnson got COVID, and there was an article, I think in the Daily Telegraph, I think it was by Alison Pearson, which said that Boris Johnson's health was linked intrinsically to the health of the nation. Now, that takes us back to James Fraser's theories about kings and the idea of the health of the monarch being bound up with the health of the realm. And I don't think anyone said that about John Major or indeed Margaret Thatcher.
Yes. No, it's intriguing. I mean, I think historians will have a lot to say about this aspect of Boris Johnson's rule. I mean, it has been said that he believes himself to be Winston Churchill, or certainly to be this kind of Churchillian saviour figure. And there's a sense in which Churchill has almost become a modern day King Arthur, in the same way that Arthur is said to return, when Britain is in peril. The same thing was said about Sir Francis Drake. If you beat Drake's drum, then Drake will return to defend England. It's almost as if there's a modern mythos now in which some Churchillian figure will be raised at a time of great crisis. And some have suggested that, Boris Johnson believes himself to be that almost mystical Churchillian leader who is there to lead the country in a time of crisis. And there are echoes certainly of Sir James Fraser in the idea that the health of the Prime Minister is bound up with that of the nation, but also it's something that you find in the reign of Henry VI. There's deep concern from his astrological physicians that Henry's ill health is actually directly causing the chaos in the country that eventually erupts up into the Wars of the Roses, and it's because the king's body is sick. Therefore, the body politic is also sick. And these are ideas that, are deeply rooted in medieval and early modern political philosophy. Things like, the king's two bodies, the sense that there is, the king's physical body, and there is also the body of sovereignty itself that the crown represents. And yet, these two things are somehow joined within the physical person of the king. And certainly that's something which you can see in at the time of the abdication crisis. There's a kind of deep concern that the crisis that was engulfing the king, Edward VIII, was actually going to destroy the whole country, and the whole country was going to unravel. It was a really quite frightening time, especially as it was around the time of the rise of fascism and shortly before Europe plunges into the Second World War. So there is a degree of truth to certainly the way in which monarchs do embody their nations, and if the monarch is unwell or the monarch is unstable, it does have this effect on the whole country, it seems.
Looking ahead, it seems that our next monarch is going to be Prince Charles, who's known to have an interest in what you might call alternative beliefs and ideas. He even had his own Rasputin figure in the form of Lawrence van der Post. So, can we look forward to a resurgence of spiritual and magical influences at the top of the British state?
That's a very interesting question. And yes, it certainly seems that there is a degree of spiritual searching in Prince Charles's life, which has not been sort of satisfied in the conventional way by conventional pieties. And yes, it's certainly interesting to speculate on what effect that might have on a ruler, even within a constitutional monarchy. If there's the slightest suspicion that your decisions are being guided by spiritual advisors or Rasputin-like figures or whoever, that certainly creates the possibility that things might come off the rails, at least on a public relations point of view. So again, I suppose I would raise the warning really about magical quietism. The figure of Richard II, undone by his reliance on his soothsayers, or indeed later figures who were very much dependent on their magical advisors. I suppose Elizabeth I is an example of somebody who always took things with a pinch of salt, in the sense that she was a practitioner of alchemy herself. She always held out hope that there might be, some money coming into the treasury from alchemists. She was prepared to, from time to time, give an audience to John Dee and listen to what he said. But ultimately, it all came back to her and her decision, and her sense of her own majesty. And so it's certainly possible for rulers to become involved in the occult as a source of their power, as one source among many. But I think the wisdom of Elizabeth I is that she never took this stuff too seriously. She allows herself to be portrayed as Diana, or portrayed as the fairy queen, or lauded as this kind of magical mistress, and yet she never quite believes her own myth. Whereas I think the difference with Charles I, for example, is that he seems to believe these hermetic masks that Inigo Jones is creating for him. So I think it's all about the the strength of somebody's character. And, it remains to be seen whether our next monarch will have that kind of strength of character.
That seems like a good note on which to close. That's all been very interesting and very pertinent to the situation in which we currently find ourselves. Dr. Francis Young, thank you.
Thank you very much.
You have been listening to Religion Off the Beaten Track with Robin Douglas. Remember to follow us on Twitter and Facebook.